He was 75 years old. He had a barren wife and no heir. He had a city, Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the oldest and most sophisticated urban centers in the ancient world, behind him. Ahead of him, a direction but no destination. A promise but no visible means of fulfillment. A voice and nothing else. And he went. Genesis 12:4 in its entirety reads, "So Abram went, as the Lord had told him." 6 words to describe one of the most consequential decisions in the history of the human race. No argument recorded, no negotiation, no request for a detailed itinerary. He went. But here is what almost nobody tells you about what happened next and what God did in a field full of dead animals in the middle of the night while Abraham lay unconscious on the ground. Because the Abrahamic Covenant is not primarily a story about Abraham's faith. It is a story about what God bound himself to when nobody else was watching. And understanding that changes everything about how you read every promise in Scripture that came after it.
Before we enter the story, we need to name a distinction that the modern world has almost entirely lost: the difference between a contract and a covenant. A contract is conditional. 2 parties agree to an exchange. If you do your part, I'll do mine. If you fail, the agreement dissolves. The relationship is transactional. The obligation is mutual and parallel. A covenant is different. A covenant is not primarily about exchange. It is about union. In the ancient Near Eastern world, the world Abraham inhabited, covenants were ratified by a specific ritual. Animals were slaughtered, cut in half. The pieces arranged in 2 rows, creating a corridor between them. Both parties would walk through. The physical act was a declaration. May what happened to these animals happen to me if I break what I have just sworn. It was not a signature on a document. It was a walked oath, an embodied promise made with the whole body in the presence of death. And this is the ritual God invited Abraham into in Genesis 15. But what happened during it was unlike any covenant ceremony in the recorded history of the ancient world, and almost nobody notices the detail that makes it extraordinary.
Genesis 12:1-3, the initial promise. God told Abram to leave his country, his people, his father's household, and go to a land he would show him. And then 3 promises, stacked one on another. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Land, nation, global blessing. And the gap between what was promised and what existed was total. Abram had no heir. His wife Sarai was barren. The text makes this specific, not incidental. The word used in Genesis 11:30 is akara, not merely childless in a temporary sense, but infertile, structurally unable. He was 75. She was 65. The promise of a great nation was given to a couple for whom the biological mechanism of nation building no longer functioned. And this is where the story becomes painfully human. Because the gap between God's promise and visible reality is not a design flaw in the Abrahamic Covenant. It is the structure. Every major covenant promise in Scripture is given before the evidence for its fulfillment exists. The promise precedes the proof. The word precedes the world it describes. And the person receiving the promise is always in the position of having to carry something that the world around them has no category for. That is what faith is in the biblical sense. Not feeling certain. Carrying the word across the gap between what exists and what is promised. But then 10 years later, the carrying had not produced the promised child. And Abraham's response was not continued serene trust. It was the honest question of a man who was now 85 years old and still waiting.
Genesis 15 opens with Abraham asking the question he had been carrying for 10 years. Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? Not, I don't believe you. Not, I've given up. How can I know? The question of a man who believes and is still in the dark. God's answer is the covenant ceremony. Bring animals, he says, a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a dove, a young pigeon. Abraham brought them all, cut them in half, arranged the pieces in 2 rows.
He sat with them all day, driving away the birds that came to land on the carcasses. And then, Genesis 15:12. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. A thick and dreadful darkness. The Hebrew is Ima Shashaka Gadola, great, thick, dreadful darkness. Abraham was not merely asleep, he was unconscious, removed from the scene, unable to participate, unable to walk through anything. And then, Genesis 15:17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. God, represented by the fire and smoke that consistently marks divine presence throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the pillar of fire, the burning bush, the Sinai fire, walked through the corridor of the covenant ceremony, alone.
Abraham did not walk through, could not walk through. He was unconscious. And this is the detail that changes everything about how the Abrahamic Covenant works. In every other A&E covenant ceremony of this type, in every parallel ritual that archaeologists and historians have documented from the surrounding cultures, both parties walked through. Both bound themselves. Both took on the consequences of failure. Here, only one. And the one who walked was God. By walking through those pieces alone, while Abraham lay unconscious, unable to participate, God was making a declaration that had never been made in quite this form before. If this covenant is broken, the consequence falls on me. Not on Abraham, not on Abraham's descendants, on God. Read that carefully. The Abrahamic Covenant does not rest on Abraham's faithfulness. It rests on God's. God bound himself, alone in the dark, while the man he was making the promise to lay unconscious on the ground, to the fulfillment of the three promises, regardless of Abraham's performance. This is what Hebrews 6:13 is describing when it says, "When God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself. He had no higher authority to invoke. He invoked himself. And what he bound himself to, alone, cannot be undone by Abraham's failure or Israel's failure, or the failure of anyone in the covenant line. It rests on the character of the one who walked through the pieces while everyone else was asleep."
After Genesis 15, 25 years still passed before the promise was fulfilled. 25 years from the original call. And in those years, Abraham was not a figure of steady, untroubled faith. He was a man doing what human beings do when the promise is real, but the wait is longer than the body can sustain. Genesis 16, he took Hagar, Sarai's servant, produced Ishmael, tried to help the promise along. And God, gently, persistently, without rejecting him, said, "Not through Ishmael." It was the specific, unassisted, biologically impossible child who would carry the covenant. Because the point was never whether Abraham could produce an heir. The point was whether God could produce one. And then, Genesis 17, Abraham was 99 years old. God appeared to him again, confirmed the covenant, told him, "Sarah will bear you a son." And Genesis 17:17. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? He laughed, not mockingly, not in defiance, with the specific incredulity of a man who had adjusted his expectations so thoroughly over 24 years of waiting that the original promise now sounded audacious. And here is the detail almost nobody notices. God did not rebuke the laugh. He said, "You will call him Isaac." Isaac means he laughs. God took the laugh of Abraham's disbelief, the involuntary, overwhelmed, barely faith-left laugh of a 99-year-old man hearing the impossible again, and embedded it permanently in the name of the promised child. Every time Abraham called his son's name, he was calling out the sound of the moment he almost didn't believe. God did not demand a better quality of faith before he kept his word. He kept his word and named the evidence after the struggle. That changes how you read every season of doubt that has ever sat inside a genuine belief.
Genesis 22 is the most testing scene in Abraham's story. Isaac had been born. The impossible child had arrived. The laugh had become a toddler, then a boy, and God asked Abraham to take him to a mountain and offer him as a sacrifice. The text does not give us Abraham's interior experience. It only gives us his actions. He rose early in the morning, he cut the wood, he saddled the donkey, he took 2 servants and the boy. He went. When the servants were left behind and Abraham and Isaac walked the final stretch alone, Isaac asked the question neither of them wanted to articulate. "Father, where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered with a sentence that carries more theological weight than most people give it. "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." Not, "I don't know." Not, "Don't ask questions." God himself will provide. And almost nobody sits with what this implies about Abraham's faith.
Hebrews 11:19 tells us what was happening inside him. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham's faith in the covenant was so rooted in the character of the one who had walked through those pieces alone that he had concluded, if God commanded this, and God made the promise, and God is faithful, then something will happen on this mountain that I cannot yet understand. The ram was provided, Isaac was spared, and God confirmed the covenant with an oath, for the first time using the full covenant language. Genesis chapter 22, verses 16 to 18. By myself I have sworn, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. By myself I have sworn. The same phrase from Hebrews 6, God invoking himself, the highest authority available. The covenant confirmed, the promise secured, on a mountain that would in another generation be the site of the temple. And eventually, on the same ridge of hills, another father would walk with another son, and the lamb would not, that time, be provided.
The question that Paul addresses in Romans 4 and Galatians 3 is one the first-century church could not avoid. If the Abrahamic Covenant was made with Abraham's physical descendants, with the nation of Israel, then what relationship do Gentile believers in Jesus have to it? Are they outside the covenant, or has the covenant expanded to include them? And Paul's argument is built on one crucial observation about the timing of Genesis 15:6. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. This verse, and the faith it describes, occurred before circumcision, before the sign of the covenant was given, before the law was received by Moses. 430 years before the law, Paul says in Galatians 3:17, which means the righteousness credited to Abraham was not based on his observance of any law or ritual. It was a response, from God, to Abraham's faith in a promise. And the promise was given to Abraham and his seed, singular, Paul argues in Galatians 3:16. Not seeds, meaning many biological descendants. Seed, meaning one, meaning Christ, the ultimate heir of the covenant, the one in whom all 3 promises, land, nation, blessing, find their fullest, final expression. And Galatians 3:29. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, and heirs according to the promise. The covenant Abraham walked away from everything for is the covenant you inherit through faith, not through biological descent, not through religious performance, not through keeping a law that came 430 years later, through the same mechanism that made Abraham righteous, believing what God has said about a promise that looks in the present impossible.
The covenant God made in that dark field was not made for Abraham alone. It was made for a people who would not exist for thousands of years, for a nation God had not yet named, for languages he had not yet created speakers of, for a time when the promise of blessing to all peoples would reach across every border and tongue and generation ever produced by the world Abraham left behind. And the one who guaranteed it, who walked through the pieces while the man slept, who swore by himself because there was no higher authority, has not broken his word. He provided the lamb on the mountain. He confirmed the oath in fire and smoke. He embedded the laugh in the child's name, a permanent record that doubt and faith are not always enemies. And he kept the promise alive through slavery and exodus and exile and silence, and then, in the fullness of time, sent the seed, the one descendant in whom the covenant was fulfilled, is being fulfilled and will finally be complete when the land, the nation, and the blessing reach their ultimate, uncontested, unhurried end. Hebrews 6:18-19. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain where our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. The anchor holds, not because you walked through the pieces, not because your faith has never faltered, not because the gap between the promise and the present has never felt total, because one walked through the pieces while you were asleep, and he has not turned back.